After Effects can take full advantage of all of the processors and RAM in your computer system. It can do this in large part because it's a 64-bit application that is also multi-threaded. Additionally, if you have enough RAM in your system, After Effects can also use multiprocessing to start multiple instances of itself to help with the rendering. Let's look at the memory and multiprocessing settings to get a better understanding of what this means. I'll also be putting the Windows Task Manager process monitor in front of After Effects so that we can see the activity of the various CPUs and memory as we work. I'll switch over to the performance monitor now by pressing Alt-Tab, then choosing Always on Top. And I'll move it over just a little bit. There. I'll go to Edit, Preferences, Memory and Multiprocessing. And here we see that the installed RAM in this computer system is 16 gigabytes, and RAM reserved for other applications is 4 gigabytes. It's strongly recommended that you reserve RAM for other applications so that you don't end up with the operating system swapping RAM to the hard disk, which greatly destroys performance. For example, if you start up an application that needs 5 gigabytes of memory, but you've only reserved 4 gigabytes for other applications, the operating system will take that 5 gigabytes, but it will do so at the expense of taking some of the information that's stored in RAM for After Effects and moving it to the hard disk temporarily. This movement of memory back and forth onto and off of the hard disk is a real performance killer. So leave this relatively high. In fact, I'm going to put this up to 5 gigabytes. Somewhere around a quarter or a third of installed RAM is a good place to start for RAM reserved for other applications. Notice that After Effects, Premiere Pro, Encore, Prelude, Adobe Media Encoder, and Photoshop all share this 11 gigabytes and can cooperate so that each takes what it needs, depending on how active it is. I currently have Render Multiple Frames Simultaneously checked. When this is checked, if there's enough RAM in the system, After Effects will start up multiple instances of itself in the background to help with the rendering during RAM preview or final output. I'll deselect this for now, and we'll try rendering for RAM preview. I'll click OK. We have a somewhat complex composition here that has several effects on an adjustment layer. These effects don't necessarily look good. They're just intended to, right now, really slow the system down so that we can see performance. I'll click RAM Preview. And here, before After Effects gets to the adjustment layer, it's rendering pretty quickly. But now it's starting to bog down now that it's gotten to the adjustment layer. And here, you can see that memory usage has increased. And all of the CPUs are active. We don't have Render Multiple Frames Simultaneously turned on, so After Effects has not started multiple instances of itself in the background, but the single instance that is running is spreading threads across all of the CPUs in the system. So, even if you don't have Render Multiple Frames Simultaneously checked, you will make use of all of the CPUs in a system. We'll let this continue rendering. And then, as soon as it finishes, RAM Preview starts, and the CPUs go back to being much less active. But notice that the RAM is still being used quite heavily because that's what a RAM preview does. It loads frames into RAM for playback. I'll stop the RAM preview. And note that the RAM is still being pretty heavily used because the frames are still being held there in case we need to play back. I'll move the performance monitor. That's what this green bar here is. This represents the RAM cache, the frames cached into RAM. If I go to Edit, Purge, All Memory, then immediately we see here in the performance monitor that memory drops off. And here we don't have any green bars because we've just purged the memory. We do have some blue bars here though, because we didn't purge the disk cache. If we want to purge what's in the disk cache, we need to go to Edit, Preferences, Media and Disk Cache. I'll move the performance monitor out of the way. And here, if I click Empty Disk Cache, pay attention to this blue bar down here. Click OK. And OK. And the blue bar is gone. Now, let's see what happens if we use render multiple frames simultaneously multiprocessing. I'll go to Edit, Preferences, Memory and Multiprocessing, and turn this back on. We have 8 CPUs installed in the system. We have 2 CPUs reserved for other applications. Again, just like with the RAM, it's important to leave enough processors for other applications as well. We have RAM allocation per background CPU of 2 GB, which is plenty for the high-definition sized frames that I'm using. If you're using digital cinema, you might need to make this higher, such as 3 or even 4 GB. Though you can't choose 4 GB from this menu, you can edit these values in the preferences file. Actual CPUs that will be used is 4. If we do the arithmetic, we have 11 GB available for After Effects. The foreground process needs to use a couple of gigabytes, so that leaves a total of 9. We're using 2 GB each, so 2 into 9 goes 4 times. So 4 CPUs will be used for background rendering. I'll click OK. And now, when I begin the RAM preview, notice it says MP here for multiprocessing. And as After Effects starts up the background processes, they each are rendering a frame on their own. Things go rather quickly until we get up to the adjustment layer. And then notice that this is jumping usually by 4 frames at a time. That's because 4 background processes are all working simultaneously, each on their own frame. And here, the CPU usage is extremely high. Every CPU is being used at full capacity for large portions of time. We'll let this finish rendering. And then, as soon as the rendering is complete, the RAM preview starts, and the CPU usage falls back down. Notice that the RAM usage fell back down as well, because during the rendering, all of those CPUs were using a lot of memory. But now that they're not using that memory for rendering anymore, and we're just storing the cached frames in RAM, the RAM usage isn't all that high. I'll stop the RAM preview. The important thing to keep in mind with regard to the memory and multiprocessing settings is that you need to leave plenty of processors and plenty of memory for other applications. Otherwise, you end up with After Effects fighting with other applications for memory and processors, and this actually does a lot of damage to performance. So, moderate settings are best. You should experiment to see what's best for your compositions and your computer system.